Alright, g'day, welcome IB Psychologist to another video tutorial. In this one we're going to tackle a really tricky exam question, how to explain an ethical consideration. When this question gets asked in the exams, a lot of students struggle, so we're going to look at how you explain an ethical consideration properly and how you can write excellent exam answers. They're going to set yours above the rest. So, this is the key question we're looking at today. How do you explain an ethical consideration? We're going to look at only explaining ethics, and so this is for short answer questions only. We won't get into the more detail about how you write an essay. Of course, you'll have to explain an ethical consideration in an essay, but then how do you discuss it? How do you show critical thinking? We won't delve into that today. We'll just look at short answer response, explaining an ethical consideration, and we'll focus specifically on human studies. We won't go into looking at the bio extensions. I'll save that for another video. So because this is such a tricky topic, I want to keep it really simple to start with. Now, first of all, the first thing to note is you're explaining considerations, you're not making condemnations, right? Most students, when they see explain an ethical consideration, they think they have to explain how or why a study is unethical. You can write about perfectly ethical studies that complied with all the ethical guidelines when you're asked about ethical considerations. You don't have to explain why a study is unethical. Okay, so that's a really important thing to note. Okay, you don't have, I won't go any further than that. That's pretty simple. So what is an ethical consideration? Well, I think the easiest thing to do for paper 1 and 2 is to just think about ethical considerations as being the ethical guidelines. The series of guidelines that we need to follow to make sure our research is ethical. So this is things like informed consent, anonymity, debriefing, etc., etc. Okay, so when you're asked to explain one ethical consideration, I would identify one of these things. All right, so these are the considerations we have to take into account. Now, so what do we need to explain about those particular guidelines or considerations? Well, first of all, you need to figure out what are the common methods used to study the topic that the question's asking about. So, for example, if it asked about ethical considerations in the brain and behavior, what are the research methods used? All right. Secondly, if you can't think of the research methods for the general topic, then at least you need to know the methods of a specific study, right? And the question might even ask you to write about a specific study, right? Explain one ethical consideration on one study related to the brain and behavior, right? So you need to know the methods. Second thing, by looking at those methods, you have to identify what's the potential for harm, right? Psychological harm, physical harm, the stress. What could be the negative outcome for the participants? Because ethics is always about reducing that negative outcome. So the consideration is, how would we, by following one of those guidelines, how could we reduce the harm, or at least reduces the chances of harm for our participants? That's what we need to understand in order to explain the ethical consideration. Now, let me give you a couple of examples, right? Let's say the question's brain and behavior. Okay, so first of all, what are the methods? Well, often when we study the brain, we change people's physiology, like their serotonin levels or their testosterone levels, and then we measure the effects that this has on the brain. That's the methods. Right? So where's the potential for harm in this? Well, okay, this could have negative effects, right? You boost up the testosterone or you boost up the hormones, you could have increased emotion, it could affect your brain activity. It also, we have to go on sometimes in an fMRI machine, so we're going to be in this cramped space. How we manipulate the physiology in injections, people might not like injections, this could be stressful, being in the fMRI might be stressful. So here are all the potentials for harm that are based on this method. Now, what's the important consideration? How can following one of those guidelines reduce that potential for harm? Well, informed consent can be really useful, because if we give participants the option and tell them ahead of time what's going to happen, they can opt out and they don't have to participate, and then they're going to avoid putting themselves in that stressful situation. If we don't give informed consent and we just say, hey, come be in our study, and then they get themselves in that environment, they might not feel like they can withdraw, they might feel pressure to carry on, and that could lead to stress. Right? So giving them informed consent, telling people ahead of time what they could expect in the study is one way that we could reduce this harm or the stress, at least, that could come about from studying their brain, putting them in an fMRI machine, altering their physiology, etc. Okay, that's one example. Let's look at another example, cognition. Okay, common methods used to study cognition. Often when we do correlational studies on cognitive processes, we have to somehow measure their cognitive abilities. For example, their working memory capacity by looking at an n-back task or a digit span task, or doing something that figures out their cognitive capabilities. Where's the potential for harm? Well, it could be quite embarrassing, right? If you do really poorly on these tests and then other people find out about it, you might feel embarrassed. If you compare your test to other people and you feel like your score is the lowest, this could be stressful. It could be embarrassing. So anonymity takes away that stress. If people a guaranteed anonymity and told, look, your test scores won't be published. You can access them if you want to. Us, I don't even know if they tell people their results. Anyway, anonymity will remove that feeling and that potential for embarrassment. Again, so here we see what's the method used, where's the potential for harm, and how can following that guideline reduce that chance for harm. Okay, and again, this is really important when we study kids because they're a little bit more vulnerable and susceptible to those sort of stressful things because their self-esteem's a bit more fragile. Now, so how do we put that into an exam answer structure? Well, the first thing you would do is you would state the consideration, right? So that what I've just explained is how you go about studying it and revising it. But when it comes to writing the exam, the structure should be, first of all, you would state the consideration, right? So, for example, informed consent is important in studies on the brain and behavior, etc. Then you would describe the methods, then the potential for harm, and finally how following that guideline will reduce the potential for harm. Right? Really important when you're writing about ethics that you state the consideration first to make sure you're focused on the question, and then you're linking the methods and the harm and explaining the guideline. Right? This is going to give you a really good explanation, and then you would use a study to support your explanation. Right? For example, informed consent. Relevant, true experiments on the brain and behavior. Then I would describe the physiology. We manipulate the brain. We put people, we manipulate physiology. We measure the brain activity. Maybe we measure the structure. We have to use things like fMRI. Then the potential for harm here is this could be stressful. People might feel claustrophobic. There's some potential embarrassment maybe if we look at their brain activity, compare it with other people. And then I talk about why informed consent is important because of this potential for harm in this methodology, right? And then because people can give their okay ahead of time, and if they don't want to participate, they can opt out before they get into those situations. So there's my explanation, and then I would go into a study like Parsimony or Radke or any study that follows these procedures, these methods to talk about. Right. Now, so some top tips to remember when explaining ethical considerations. Right. Number one, I try and keep it simple. True experiments and with informed consent. Right. So you have to revise research methods. So I tell my students to link true experiments with informed consent. Always just link those two, and correlational studies with anonymity. It just, for me, it just simplifies it. It keeps it easy. Second point, beneficence. This just means do no harm, right? Don't harm your participants, and this could be this is a consideration from the Belmont report, and it could be helpful because if you're asked, to explain one consideration, well, often they work together, right? Anonymity and informed consent, promising anonymity in your informed consent, and then if you don't give all the information, then maybe the debriefing. So it's often hard to identify the one specific in consideration, and if you're struggling because you see that all those guidelines are kind of interrelated, then you can identify the one consideration as beneficence and then write about those 2 or 3 of those guidelines under that one umbrella. So in terms of approaching the exam questions, that can be quite helpful. All right, third tip, another simplifying tip could be research methods and ethics. Use the same studies and explanations of the methodology. Okay, so similar to what I said before. If you're going to revise true experiments, then revise the true experiments and then use those same experiments to write about ethical considerations. Now, I've gone ahead and done this for you in our revision textbook. So if you've got a copy of that, you'll be able to see this is at the end of the biological approach, so you have to know the research methods. So this is, I focus on true experiments, and here's the summary of how and why they're used, and the studies, and then on the reverse page, I've linked the ethical considerations. So the ethical consideration, the explanations of why informed consent is important in true experiments is explained, and so the methods are linked with the ethical consideration, and then the same studies are used as examples. So this is just one way to simplify it. But if you don't have the revision book, you can definitely do this by yourself with the own studies and the own materials that you're using in your course. Right, that's it. I hope that was helpful. I'm posting a lot of stuff about ethics and other materials on our blog. If you go on there, you'll be able to see this article, and then I'll explain what I've just talked about in this video in another blog post shortly as well. We've got our Facebook group, so our revision book is out. All the links are in the description. Hit subscribe. Also, Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter, daily tweets with exam tips, just like a one-sentence simple exam tip. It might just be helpful for you. So I hope that helps. It is pretty tricky. The best way to do it is practice, 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 and then get feedback from your teacher. But yeah, good luck.